It might have been quiet and very comfortable in one of the city parks along a rough, narrow river, if it had not been for a merry band of young people to whom everything and everywhere was allowed, who had settled down on the waterfronts. At any rate, that was the opinion of the rich men. The oldest of them was barely 20, but the boys already thought they had every right to be rude and teach life to an elderly woman who had decided to spend her evening strolling by the river with her little dog. It was always quiet here. One could sit on a bench, throw stones into the dark water, and at least just daydream. This place was meant to soothe and pacify the souls of the townspeople, to distract them from the vanity of the world and the wickedness of men. But on this day, such relaxation unfortunately was not possible for one simple reason. And all because the rich kids climbed up on the back of one of the benches with their feet shod in expensive brand shoes, raising such a noise with their loud voices mixed with swearing that even the local drunkard Bob, who decided to take a nap under the bush in the nearby grove, tired after a hard day's work, could envy them. But the man had to look for a new place to sleep because he realized that there was nothing for him here. Having not withstood such lawlessness, Sarah Hubbard wanted to reprimand the young people to behave in a more civilized manner. But instead of listening to an elderly person, the company of two boys and a girl only laughed at her, making her run home with her dog to take sedative drops. The young girl with the bright red hair was especially zealous in her conversation. In a response to a seemingly harmless remark, she really lashed out at the poor grandmother. "Why are you picking on us, Grandma? Don't you have anything better to do? You have long been falling off the chaff, and you still make remarks to us. You'd better go to your grandfather, and we don't need to read a moral to us. Do you even know who we are? And if you don't know, why are you bothering? If you keep this up, you might end up losing your pension, because they're going to hold it back." Sarah Hubbard almost fainted from shock. The pensioner worked all her life as a school teacher, but in her many years of teaching experience, she had never come across such specimens. So, furtively wiping away her tears, the woman hurried away, and the company, laughing, continued to have fun. Meanwhile, not far away, in a poorly furnished old apartment, a woman, weary from a long illness, lay on a narrow, creaky bed. Elizabeth Thomas' eyes were wet, and not from the pain that was gnawing at her side, for she had long since become accustomed to it and tried to ignore it, crying out only when the wavy contractions became absolutely unbearable. But that was only when Elizabeth purposely skipped her medication, and of course, it was not because she wanted to go into the next world as soon as possible. Like everyone else, she wanted to live, to enjoy the success of her daughter, who was graduating this year with honors from the Polytechnic, to wait for her grandchildren after all. But about this, apparently, she did not even have the right to dream, because the disease knocked her off her feet, and everything happened because of a doctor's mistake. For a simple scheduled surgery Elizabeth was laid 6 months ago, and got up from the operating table, she was already crippled, who had to take care of her daughter. From that woman to save money and skipping taking precious medications, because in order to buy them, her daughter had an addiction to her studies and waitressing almost every night, after which also go to class. Amy wanted to quit university altogether, but on her knees, her mother dissuaded her from doing it because otherwise it would have killed her. The woman felt unbelievably sorry for her daughter. That is why her eyes were always wet, because in fact, she ruined the life of her little blood, who had no time even for personal life. She neglected her boyfriend Giles altogether, though he, to her great amazement, for she had previously had an entirely different opinion of him, and also taken an evening job at an auto repair shop, and gave all the money he earned to buy medications for his future mother-in-law. "You will dance at our wedding, Elizabeth. We'll put you on your feet," the young man consoled her, whose parents were already retired and required care, and now she was hanging on him like a weight. And most importantly, the doctor who had made a mistake got away with it. Cleverly, the doctor forged all the documents and certificates, and it all turned out that she herself was to blame. Had it been an accidental mistake, she would not have said a word. Is it possible to punish a person in such a case? But the rude one turned out, instead of watching the patient, the doctor and one of the nurses were engaged in no medical practice, locked in one of the rooms. And meanwhile, the patient began to have irreversible consequences after the operation, which led to such a sad outcome. If only her husband William were alive, he would never have allowed her to suffer so much. After all, the man was a God-given lawyer. He handled the most difficult cases. But unfortunately, he died suddenly in a car accident many years ago. Poor woman was thinking about all this when the door to her room quietly opened and her daughter Amy came in. On a tray, the girl brought a large, tasty, rich broth with bits of meat floating in it and a glass of water and her pills. With greed, the girl looked at the fragrant smoke rising over the plate, for she herself had only eaten a crust of stale bread all day. The only good thing about this day was that today was her shift at the restaurant, which meant that perhaps she would get something in the kitchen. "Thank you, sweetheart, but you didn't have to worry about me so much. I'd wish you'd gone out with Giles instead of standing at the stove. Maybe even go to the park, take a walk on the promenade before work. It's so beautiful there," Elizabeth told her, trying to smile. But instead of the once open, cheerful smile, she only managed to get some grimace of despair out of herself. "We're going to the park with Giles today, Mom. We'll have about an hour before work. I hope you can manage on your own here," her daughter answered cheerfully. "Of course," nodded affirmatively to the sick woman, who had to take her medicine, for she had no strength to endure it. Amy left her with peace of mind and ran out of the apartment to the park, where Giles was waiting for her. But an unfortunate mishap awaited the couple that evening. If it had not been for her, however, it would not have been for the dramatic change in his and his mother's lives. It turned out that there was an urgent order in the workshop, where he worked with her boyfriend. So, Giles had to go to work earlier than usual, which ruined their date. Amy only found out when she got to the place where she was supposed to meet him. She was upset. They seldom had such a chance to go on a date. And now, she would have to go to a restaurant instead of a pleasant walk to work, not to sit idly by herself on a bench. At least there was a chance to earn a tip. So Amy did, turning to the exit of the park, which was at the very end of the promenade. It looked like she might still be able to get at least a little fresh air and some distraction. However, Amy's way passed by a company of rich people on a bench, children of very wealthy and influential businessmen in their area, one of whom was even running for governor. If, of course, the businessman could beat the current mayor of their city. To her shame, she did not even know the mayor in person, because it was not long ago that a woman appeared in their area. However, Amy had her good things about Della McKinney, especially about how zealously she took up corrupt officials of different levels and allocated money from the budget to build a new hospital. Roads in the city have also begun to change. The embankment, which was already covered with potholes, unexpectedly received money which had mysteriously disappeared before it appeared. It was a pity for the people of the city to let go such a sensible and surprisingly honest mayor. However, they understood perfectly well that the governor's position would give them more chances to get back from their knees at last, and even to become the leader by welfare among other regions of the country. However, some of the citizens and his entourage did not like the mayor's boldness in this respect. Among these were members of the so-called Golden Youth, whose position in the city was becoming more and more precarious. It was more and more difficult for their parents to acquit their offspring in front of various law enforcement officials. After all, they became afraid of bribes, as if they were afraid of fire, although before it did not cause any problems. That's exactly what Bryce, son of that businessman who were running for governor, was talking about with his girlfriend Deborah and their mutual friend, and therefore, no lesser scoundrel Peter. However, soon the profound conversation of the rich men was interrupted by the approach of a simple girl in a light and very cheap dress, because the girl simply had no money for some brand clothes. However, it just so happened that all four of them were in the same group at the university. Although the three rich men and Amy were doing very differently, because of the trio of big-headed dummies had not managed to take a single exam on their own. The students' parents, who had to pay a lot of money and use all their connections in order not to kick the trio out of school, were studying for them. Amy was the first to notice Deborah, and she whistled as she did so. Look who's parading in the middle of the road like a top model on a catwalk. That's the bespectacled toad, the beggar in our group. When my father becomes governor, I'll be sure to ask him to pass a law forbidding such lowlifes to go to university at all. After all, she is like an eyesore in our group, where the high society gathered, and she is the daughter of a cook or kindergarten teacher. Her father was a famous lawyer, but he's been dead for 10 years, Bryce answered, laughing like a horse. Why don't we invite her to your birthday party tomorrow, Deborah? And then we'll slip something in her drink and post the video online afterwards. It'll be hilarious. The whole institute will laugh at our bespectacled scarecrow, said Peter, the smartest guy of the rich trio. One might say he was even the company's brain panner. As soon as Amy approached the company, she was immediately hailed by them, calling her in a polite way and inviting her to a birthday party. At the same time, Deborah offered Amy to write for her as a present, so she wouldn't have to worry about not being able to buy a present. Just because there would be various treats at the country house, and Amy agreed, because she was terribly hungry and tomorrow was just her day off. I suppose I could bring something nice for my mother too, she thought. She was ashamed of it though, for she felt like a real thief. Well, that's good. We know you were a true friend. Don't be late, there's a real surprise for you, laughed Bryce after the girl who had already left in a hurry to work. In the meantime, the group had also left. They had a fun evening ahead of them, which was to carry on into the night. They got up from the bench and marched briskly away, completely forgetting about the remaining expensive briefcase that Bryce's father had asked his son to deliver on the way home to one of his companions. The businessman was late for his plane to the capital, so he asked his offspring for such a seemingly trivial matter. However, the gubernatorial candidate had better not do it because the briefcase contained very important documents comprising both him and the other corrupt officials. Della McKinney meticulously collected all this evidence, but the briefcase was stolen for her by office by a man specifically for Bryce's father. The woman was very nervous and suffered for it, calling herself the last word for the fact that she had been so careless in keeping important evidence. Now nothing would prevent the scoundrel from running for governor, and from there it would be impossible to overthrow him, for his throne was too heavy. But so far, the woman did not know how miraculously her papers would be returned to her. As soon as the company of rich men disappeared around the corner, forgetting the briefcase by the bench, the thirsty Bob appeared right in front of her. In a flash, the drunkard picked up the briefcase and dashed into the bushes like lightning. But Amy noticed his maneuver because it was at that moment she came back to ask him at what address the party would be held, because the company was having so much fun that everybody had somehow forgotten about this important moment. In a rush, the girl rushed after the thief. Realizing that he was exposed, Bob threw his burden into the muddy gutter so that the briefcase opened and all the papers lying around were scattered. He ran away. Amy, meanwhile, went down into the ditch, obligingly gathering up the papers, growing darker and darker at the same time. Even to the layman, everything was obvious because there were many very interesting photos of the gubernatorial candidate's evil deeds. Without thinking twice, Amy went with the briefcase straight to the police, completely forgetting that they were waiting for her in the restaurant. Della McKinney was surprised when a friend of the policeman, who helped her to collect the evidence, urgently summoned her to his office, promising her a real surprise. However, the surprise was no less overwhelming for the waiting mayor, Amy. She nearly fainted when she finally saw the mayor for the first time. The woman looked just like her mother, and there were very simple reasons for that. Years ago, her mother had told her a terrible story about her father's betrayal. Years ago, on the day his wife gave birth to twins, and being at home in a serious condition under the care of an old healer, while the ambulance was going to her, he gave one of his daughters to his best friend, whose wife had given birth under the same conditions, but their baby girl did not survive. Gary knew full well that his wife would not want to live after that. After all, as the doctors told her, she would have no more chances to get pregnant. Of course, Stewart would never take such a sin on his soul, but he owed it to Gary, for he had once saved his life. The man had been in his debt ever since. It was a cruel way to repay a debt, but the man saw no other way, for according to the law of the streets, he had grown up, and this unwritten code was very strict. He could not refuse. Just before his death, the old man told his daughter what he had done. Good thing his wife was no longer alive by then. The official was almost crazy with happiness, because she could not even imagine that she had not only a sister, but also a niece. The newly formed family had a lot to talk about, but the first thing to do was to put an end to the bandits in the higher echelons of the city. The very next day, the rich men were already biting their teeth. They regretted the fact that they had invited the sissy to the celebration. After all, it was she who laughed at them in the end, uploading the network piquant video, where they were caught red-handed. No sooner had Peter slipped some trash into Amy's glass, than the handcuffs slapped on his hands, as indeed did Deborah and Bryce. The whole house was full of illegal drugs and more. But worst of all, there was no one to help the Golden Youth, because their parents were arrested at the same time. Now the gubernatorial candidate can qualify only for the place of the warden in the colony. Madly glad to meet her sister Elizabeth, and indeed not even the woman had hoped for such happiness. But the most important thing was that now her daughter could safely finish her studies at university. She no longer had to work with her fiancé earning her medicine. Thanks to the mayor, the hospital where she had the operation was now sorted out who was right and who was wrong. The medical institution had to pay for the woman's treatment, and then to collect the money spent from the negligent doctor. The woman paid dearly for his mistake, but if it were not for her, she would have never seen her own sister because the woman was not interested in politics. With a large margin overtook other candidates, Della McKinney in the gubernatorial election taking seriously the work of the new post. Her niece, however, had little interest in the affairs of her high-ranking aunt. She did not need favor, and she herself could make her way in life. The girl was busy preparing for her university exams, After which, a prestigious job and happiness in the family next to the man she loved awaited her.